Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Arab foreign ministers call for Syria to regain control of all of its territory. So the foreign ministers of Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt met in Amman on Monday to discuss a solution to the crisis in Syria in the latest step toward Damascus fully normalizing with regional countries. So the ministers released a joint statement that said some very interesting things. It expressed support for Syria to regain control of all of its territory, which includes the area of eastern Syria occupied by U.S. forces. According to the statement, the ministers agreed to work to, quote, support Syria and its institutions in any legitimate efforts to extend its controls over its lands and impose the rule of law and end the presence of armed and terrorist groups on Syrian lands and stop foreign interference in Syrian internal affairs, end quote. The ministers support working to, quote, gradually reach a political solution that ends the suffering of the brotherly Syrian people and the catastrophic consequences of the Syrian crisis, achieves national reconciliation, and puts Syria on the road to reconstruction, end quote. They agreed to establish working groups to build on the progress made in the meeting. After the meeting, Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi said, quote, the meeting is the beginning of an Arab-led political path to reach a solution to the crisis, end quote. So, this is significant because it's three pretty strong, countries that are very aligned with the U.S., although Saudi Arabia has definitely been kind of going its own way more recently, but Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt, saying that they support efforts to get the U.S. out of Syria and lift sanctions because they're saying that they want to work toward Syrian reconstruction, and U.S. sanctions on Syria are specifically designed to prevent Syria's reconstruction. So, this is another sign that, this U.S. presence, this U.S. occupation of Syria doesn't seem like it's going to be sustainable if all the countries in the region, including the U.S.'s friends, are against it. I think eventually something will have to give. It could still take a while, but I think this is all, good news in the sense that it will probably ultimately lead to the U.S., giving up its war in Syria. So the Saudis and Jordan, they've been leading the effort to bring Syria back into the Arab League, which Damascus was expelled from in 2011. And the U.S. has strongly opposed all of these efforts. They've come out against them, say that they are against countries upgrading their ties with the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. They want to keep the country under sanctions and they want to keep the occupation going. So, when it comes to the territory that the U.S. controls, it's a pretty significant portion of the country. It's about 1/3 of Syria's territory, and the U.S. is able to do that with only 900 troops because they back the Kurdish-led SDF in that area. And again, this is where most of Syria's oil resources are. The U.S. has bases, right on oil and gas fields in this part of the country. So that's a lot of what it's about too, is controlling the resources in the country. All right, so the next one here, another Syria, Israeli airstrikes again target Syria's Aleppo airport. So Israeli airstrikes put Syria's Aleppo airport out of service and hit other targets on the outskirts of the city on Monday night. This is according to Syrian media. So the strikes killed one Syrian soldier and wounded 5 more soldiers and 2 civilians. The incident marked the third time since March that Israeli airstrikes put the Aleppo International Airport out of service. The city of Aleppo was devastated by the earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey in February, and the airport has been a vital channel for aid. And so it was twice in March that they bombed this airport, and now again. And this is just another example of how Israel seems to have really ramped up its airstrikes in Syria this year, more so just in recent months, in March April, and now it's continuing. There seemed like there was a little lull for a few weeks, but there was some artillery shelling in Syria. But now it seems like the airstrikes are back. And Saturday, as I went over yesterday, early Saturday morning, there was another Israeli airstrike in the Syrian city of Homs, which wounded 3 civilians. And again, Israel rarely, comments on these individual strikes, but they do, say that they brag about, how they've launched hundreds of airstrikes in Syria. And, there's always the question of U.S. cooperation with these strikes, because we know the U.S. has that El Tamf garrison in southern Syria. It's one of the U.S. bases there. And if Israel wants to launch an airstrike from that direction, they have to clear it with the U.S. So a lot of these airstrikes, the U.S. could be signing off on. All right, the next one here, Biden reaffirms the U.S. defense of the Philippines. So President Biden hosted Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. at the White House on Monday amid heightened tensions with China. And he told Marcos that the U.S. commitment to defending the Philippines is ironclad. So in comments ahead of the meeting with Marcos, Biden said that the U.S., quote, remains ironclad in our commitment to the defense of the Philippines, including the South China Sea, and we're going to continue to support the Philippines' military modernization goals, end quote. So Marcos told Biden that the Philippines was located in, quote, arguably the most complicated geopolitical situation in the world right now. And so it is only natural that for the Philippines to look to its sole treaty partner in the world to strengthen and to redefine the relationship that we have and the roles that we play in the face of those rising tensions that we see now around the South China Sea and Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific regions, end quote. So this visit comes as tensions are soaring in the South China Sea, where China, the Philippines, and several other Southeast Asian nations have overlapping claims. And as I went over yesterday, there was a recent encounter between a Chinese ship and a Philippine vessel. It almost resulted in a collision, leading to the U.S. reminding China that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to Philippine boats. And according to the White House, Biden reaffirmed that again in this meeting. The White House said that Biden underscored that an armed attack in the Pacific, which includes the South China Sea, on Philippine armed vessels, armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft, including those of the Coast Guard, would invoke U.S. mutual defense commitments under Article 4 of the 1951 U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. So Marcos's visit to Washington, it also comes after Washington and Manila. They recently signed a deal to expand the U.S. military presence in the Philippines. The U.S. gets access to 4 new bases, bringing it to a total of 9 bases that the U.S. can rotate forces through in the country. They also just wrapped up their largest ever military exercises. They are really trying to strengthen this alliance. And on Monday, Biden and Marcos agreed to take other steps to strengthen this alliance. Nothing major here, but according to the White House, the U.S. said that it will transfer military equipment to the Philippines' armed forces, including 2 Island-class patrol vessels, 2 Protector-class patrol vessels, and 3 C-130 aircraft. And the White House also said the 2 countries have adopted a bilateral defense guideline that will increase cooperation, interoperability across land, sea, airspace, and cyberspace. And the U.S. and the Philippines are also taking steps to boost economic cooperation. And Marcos's efforts to strengthen ties with the U.S., it breaks from the policies of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who at one point wanted to kick U.S. forces out of his country. And Duterte, he did favor closer ties to China, even with all the tensions in the South China Sea, although he did ultimately reverse his plans to kick the U.S. troops out of the country. He was not going to do something like what Marcos is doing now. So the next one here, another Philippines story. The U.S. is ready to help the Philippines resupply a ship in the South China Sea. So the head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet has said that the U.S. is ready to help the Philippines resupply a grounded naval ship in the South China Sea. And this is from a report from Nikkei Asia. So back in 1999, the Philippines intentionally ran a World War II era ship aground on Second Thomas Shoal, which is an atoll in the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, to reinforce their territorial claims to the waters. So they use this kind of as a little outpost now, this ship that's been run aground there. And Admiral Samuel Paparos, who is the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, he said that China frequently interferes with Manila's attempts to resupply personnel who are stationed on the grounded ship. And he said, quote, "We stand ready to come to the Philippines' assistance in their exercise of their sovereign rights," end quote. He said that so far the Philippines has not requested the help of the U.S. Coast Guard or Navy. And now, if American vessels do end up doing this, helping the Philippines bring supplies to this grounded ship, if, this really risks dangerous encounters between US and Chinese vessels. It was at Second Thomas Shoal that incident happened last week, where the Chinese boat blocked the Philippine boat and there was almost a collision. So now just add a US ship or Coast Guard boat to that equation, and, things can really spiral and get out of hand quickly, I think, in a scenario like that. So the South China Sea, I just go over some of the background again that I just did. So according to this interview with Paparo, he expressed interest in a multilateral framework that would include Japan and Australia maintaining security in the South China Sea. And so if Japan and Australia get in on these types of patrols, that would be another thing that really raises tensions with China if they see that happening, because they're saying now that they're being encircled by the US and its allies. And that would just be another reason for them to kind of increase, I think, their military outposts there in the South China Sea. So uh, things look like they're going to really heat up over these disputed rocks and reefs over there. So Washington and Manila recently inked. Oh, sorry, that's just more background than I just went over. But if you're watching the video here, you'll see the map of the South China Sea, and it's pretty useful. It has all the overlapping claims, and it shows the Spratly Islands. So that's where Second Thomas Shoal is, which is one of the where that Philippine grounded ship is, and where those two ships almost collided. That's the main area where the Philippines and China have problems. All right. The next one here, Taiwanese leader meets with John Bolton. So this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Former American National Security Advisor John Bolton completed a week-long tour of Taiwan by meeting President Tsai Ing-wen. During the meeting, Tsai claimed Taiwan was on the front line in the fight for democracy, and as such, Taipei needs stronger ties with like-minded nations. According to a press release from Tsai's office, she said, quote, "As Taiwan stands on the front line of the defense of democracy," she said that we are not only determined, but also well prepared to protect our homeland. End quote. The document continued, quote, "further stating that Taiwan is willing to deepen cooperation with the United States and all other like-minded partners to jointly safeguard peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, as well as the values of freedom and democracy," end quote. Kyle mentions a new bipartisan bill that was introduced in Congress called the Taiwan Cybersecurity Resiliency Act. And this legislation would require the Pentagon to broaden and strengthen cybersecurity cooperation with Taiwan by conducting cyber training exercises, defending the country's military networks, infrastructures, and systems, and leveraging U.S. cybersecurity technologies to help Taiwan against Chinese attacks. So back to the Tsai-Bolton meeting, of course, Bolton is just an uber hawk. And I think it goes to show, the type of people in the U.S. that Tsai and her Democratic Progressive Party are aligning with. And Tsai praised Bolton for his role in promoting Washington's military support for Taipei. Bolton, who has held several positions in the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, has long called for Washington to take a more aggressive stance against China. In a 2017 op-ed published by the Wall Street Journal, Bolton called for arming Taiwan and sending troops to the island. He said he wanted to make Taiwan into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. He's additionally called on Washington to revise or revoke the One China policy. So Bolton praised President Joe Biden after the Wall Street Journal said about 200 American troops would be deployed to Taiwan, but he's demanding that the White House does more. He says the U.S. should home port a couple of American naval vessels in Taiwan. That would be very, very big provocation toward Beijing. And of course, that's what Bolton is calling for. He's not shy about his hawkishness. And I know that he is, he's been talking about maybe running for president. I don't think he would get very far, but of course, this is something he does while he's teasing a presidential run and goes over there and visits Taiwan. Because politically, right now, especially if you're a Republican, uh, supporting Taiwan and trying to provoke and being tough toward China, despite the risk of provocation, is very popular politically. All right, the next one here. So this is from the South China Morning Post, and it's about Li Hu, who is the Chinese diplomat that is going over to Ukraine. It just has some interesting information about him. So China's point man in Ukraine, Li Hu, has been tasked with what some believe is an impossible mission, trying to broker peace. He's a special envoy for Eurasian affairs since 2019. He is a fluent Russian speaker and spent 10 years as ambassador to Russia, but observers say this does not mean he will be biased toward Moscow. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry announced that he's going to Ukraine. He's going to speak with all parties involved in the crisis, and it remains to be seen how far Beijing's mediation can go when neither Moscow nor Kiev has shown willingness to back down, but China is keen to play a role in ending the conflict. So Li spent 10 years as ambassador to Russia until 2019. He was promoted to a special envoy status in China, and his status as a former deputy foreign minister gives him more weight when communicating Beijing's message. So he's a pretty seasoned Chinese diplomat, and hopefully he makes some progress in working toward peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, actually, I got to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. And at the top of the page today, we have an important message from Scott Horton, our editorial director, best known for his podcast and radio show, The Scott Horton Show, and all the books that he's written. We have some words from him. And again, I mentioned yesterday, I think, that if you're not signed up for our newsletter, especially around fundraising time, it's very important because you get our fundraiser letters and see ways you can support us. If you go to antiwar.com/newsletter, you can get the daily update newsletter and a weekly newsletter. Just check those two boxes and put in your email address. And it's a way you can kind of keep up on everything. The daily newsletter, you get that every day, and it just has the show and the news stories. But anyway, back to the fundraiser. This is how we get by. We're entirely reader funded, and as Scott says here, right now, the U.S. what they're doing, what they have their eyes on is possibly full scale war with other major powers, which Scott says threatens not just our entire country, but also nuclear winter and the planet's ability to sustain our population of more than 8 billion people. So that is really what we're up against right now. And that's why we need your help. Antiwar.com/donate. All right, back to the news here. So the next one, Russia's Wagner head wants more ammo for Bakhmut. So this is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's the head of the Russian mercenary group Wagner. He renewed a call on Monday for Russia to provide more ammunition to his forces who are fighting for control of the Donbas city of Bakhmut. Prigozhin made the comments in a video on his Telegram channel that was recorded while he was inspecting rifles in a warehouse somewhere near Bakhmut. He said that his forces need at least 300 tons of artillery ammunition each day. He said, quote, 300 tons a day is 10 cargo containers, not a lot at all. But we are being given no more than a third of that, end quote. And, he's been pretty critical of Russia's military leadership, calling for more support, saying that his mercenary force is not receiving enough support, saying a lot of his guys are dying there in this brutal, brutal battle for Bakhmut, which has been raging for over 8-9 months now. And the Wagner group and regular Russian forces now control the majority of the city, according to South Front. I put in one of their maps. Russia has control of almost 90% of Bakhmut, and Ukraine is just holding out in these western areas of the city. So Zelensky has refused to give up the city, and Ukrainian soldiers have been sent into battle, also with little ammunition, but and very little training. Zelensky previously said that if he loses Bakhmut, he would be put under domestic and international pressure to compromise with Russia. Ukraine is expected to launch a counteroffensive soon that will likely be focused on the south, which is, Zaporozhye and Kherson, the land bridge that Russia has secured to Crimea. According to the Pentagon documents that were recently leaked and other reports, the U.S., the Biden administration, doesn't seem to have much confidence in this coming Ukrainian counteroffensive. So Prigozhin was also saying the other day that a counteroffensive is coming. A Ukrainian counteroffensive is inevitable. He said something like that. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone again over at the Libertarian Institute. In Russia, there was shelling that killed civilians and explosions derailed a freight train. A Russian governor says that explosions rocked his region over 2 consecutive days. On Sunday, the governor of the Bryansk Oblast posted on Telegram that 4 civilians had been killed by Ukrainian shelling. The next day, a train was derailed by an explosion. So the governor of the region, and it borders Ukraine, this oblast, reported that 4 civilians were killed during Sunday's attack, which he said, again, was artillery shelling. And then on Monday, he said that his region again came under fire when an explosion derailed a freight train. So this freight train derailed. There was no casualties in this incident, according to this governor. And Kiev has not commented on the attacks, which is typical. But this is, it seems like there's been a lot of attacks inside Russia now. Pretty frequently, we're seeing reports like this. All right. So the next one here, a bill would make Iran sanctions law permanent. So a bipartisan group of lawmakers in the House and the Senate on Monday introduced a bill that would make a law authorizing sanctions on Iran permanent. The 1996 Iran Sanctions Act, the ISA, gives the president the authority to impose sanctions on Iran and needs to be continuously renewed by Congress. So this legislation that was introduced on Monday, which is called the Solidifying Iran's Sanction Act, would get rid of the ISA's sunset clause, so it would make it a permanent law. In the House, the bill was introduced by Representative Michelle Steele, Republican from California, and so far it has 24 co-sponsors, including 16 Republicans and 8 Democrats, so a bipartisan effort. Michael McCall is a co-sponsor. He's the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said, quote, "This bill takes the long overdue step of striking the arbitrary sunset from the law so that sanctions will only be lifted if Iran stops its threatening behavior. Iran can't run out the clock on U.S. law," end quote. So the Senate's version of the bill was led by Senators Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, Maggie Hassan, Democrat from New Hampshire, Bill Hagerty, Republican from Tennessee, and Jackie Rosen, Democrat from Nevada. Again, bipartisan effort here. The introduction of the legislation comes after the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen acknowledged that U.S. sanctions on Iran have caused a real economic crisis but have not changed the behavior of the government, meaning the sanctions are doing little but hurting ordinary Iranians. History has shown us, that U.S. sanctions do little to change the targeted government and always hurt civilians. Back in February, UN experts said that more Iranians are dying from a blood disorder due to Western sanctions that deprive them of specialized medicines and the ingredients to make them. Just one example of the cruelty of these sanctions. Even though Yellen acknowledged that, they're not working, she said they're going to put more on Iran, and they have put more on Iran since then, mostly symbolic since the country's already under so many sanctions. But, the U.S. just seized that tanker that was headed to China with Iranian oil. So that could be how they're stepping up their sanctions enforcement, is by just taking their oil. All right, the next one here, McCarthy will invite Netanyahu to D.C. if President Biden does not. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy offered strong support to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during a visit to Israel, saying that he'll invite the Israeli leader to address Congress if President Biden does not invite him to the White House. Excuse me. So McCarthy told the newspaper Israel Hayom when he arrived in Israel on Sunday that Biden has waited too long now to invite Netanyahu to Washington. Back in March, President Biden said he would not invite Netanyahu in the near term and criticized the Israeli leader's judicial overhaul plans. And, I know there's a few aspects to it, but I think the major thing with his plan is that it would give the Knesset the power to override Israel's top court, their Supreme Court, with a simple majority. So it would take away a lot of power from the court and give a lot of power to the Knesset. So Netanyahu's plans are currently on pause as he faced major opposition to the policy. Besides the mild criticism of the judicial overhaul, while he said that and he hasn't invited Netanyahu to speak, Biden hasn't signaled any real change to the support for Israel. The U.S. is still backing them in all sorts of ways, as they always have, and he's repeatedly reaffirmed his support for the country. So on Monday, McCarthy delivered a speech to Israel's Knesset and reaffirmed that there is strong bipartisan support for Israel in Congress. And reflecting that, the top Democrat in the House, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, he's a Democrat, and he just led the delegation to Israel. I think they just got back to the U.S. And in comments to Jewish Insider, Jeffries dismissed the notion that the U.S. could leverage aid to Israel due to the judicial overhaul or other policies, calling the idea a non-starter. So there are very few Democrats, the progressive Democrats, that do think the U.S. should leverage aid to Israel. And I mean, that's just like, I could count them on one hand, I think. Representative Josh Gottheimer, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, he joined Jeffries in Israel, and he said that the delegation, and again, this is the Democrat-led delegation, they emphasized that, quote, regardless of any issues in Israel, the relationship transcends domestic Israeli politics and remains special and ironclad, end quote. And the congressional visits to Israel, forget the judicial overhaul. There's also been a spike in violence against Palestinians as Netanyahu's government has stepped up raids in the West Bank. The governing coalition includes extremist settlers who want to significantly expand settlements with the ultimate goal of annexing the West Bank. And these plans, there's been some, the Biden administration, the State Department, they're going to say things, oh, we don't support expanding settlements, but there hasn't really been any real criticism of these policies. That stuff doesn't matter as much. All right. The last one here is just something we have up in the blog, and it's a Democracy Now! Interview with Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, who unfortunately has been diagnosed with cancer and just given a few months to live. So go check that out. They had, I believe it's an hour long. Yeah. So definitely that would be worth your time to see what he has to say. That's it for the news. Go check out all the viewpoints we have. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington's egregious deceptions about the Russia-Ukraine war. One from Joseph Solis Mullen over at the Libertarian Institute, What the China Literature Gets Wrong. And that's about all these books, a lot of books in recent years from, DC think tankers and those types about how China is trying to take over the world and they're the huge threat, and it's kind of trying to debunk that narrative. And Joseph mentions that he's actually writing his own book about what he calls the fake China threat, and that's going to be published at the Libertarian Institute. I think he said this year, so that's cool. That could be a really important book. And then one from Caitlin Johnstone over at her site, The Pentagon Claims It Encircles Russia and China for Defense. One from Responsible Statecraft from Alina Inthali, The Day the Bombs Rained Down in Laos. And one from Chris Hedges. What is he writing on Substack now? The Giant Sucking. Oh no, this is from SheerPost. The Enemy from Within by Chris Hedges. So go check that out. But that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. You can support us. Please help us with the fundraiser so we can keep it going. antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Leave comments. Leave reviews if you listen to the podcast. That's it for me. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.